The Midnight Express sat on the platform like a sleeping beast, its sleek black exterior shimmering under the dim glow of the station lights. A thin mist clung to the ground, curling like ghostly fingers around the train's wheels. The whistle had not yet sounded, but passengers moved with quiet urgency, dragging luggage and clutching tickets as though the very act of boarding would shield them from the night's oppressive silence. Among the passengers were an eclectic mix of souls, each lost in their own world. A middle-aged businessman in a tailored suit spoke in hushed tones on his cell phone, his face lined with weariness. A young woman with fiery red hair leaned against a pillar, nervously flipping through a dog-eared book. Two elderly sisters, dressed in matching shawls, clutched hands as if to ward off an unseen chill. And then there was the tall man in the long trench coat, who carried nothing but an empty gaze that seemed to pierce through everyone he passed. The train's conductor, a gaunt figure with sunken eyes, stood at the first car's door, inspecting tickets with mechanical precision. His uniform, though impeccably pressed, seemed out of time, the fabric worn and buttons tarnished. When he raised his gaze to meet the passengers, his expression was unreadable, a mix of duty and something far colder. "Welcome aboard the Midnight Express," he intoned, his voice carrying an almost hypnotic cadence. "Please mind the gap." As the last stragglers boarded, the train exhaled a long, shuddering hiss, as if impatient to depart. Inside, the carriages were a strange blend of old-world charm and unsettling modernity. Plush velvet seats in deep burgundy lined the walls, their edges adorned with golden tassels. Overhead lamps cast pools of warm light, but their flickering suggested they were not entirely reliable. The air smelled faintly of smoke and lavender, an odd combination that seemed to cling to the skin. A young man named Eric settled into his seat near the window, glancing nervously at the other passengers. He was a journalist, traveling to cover a story in the next city, a profile piece on a reclusive artist who rarely granted interviews. Despite his excitement about the assignment, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him the moment he stepped onto the platform. The train felt wrong. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about the Midnight Express was off. Across the aisle, an elderly man with a weathered face and trembling hands unfolded a yellowed newspaper. He caught Eric's eye and offered a weak smile. "First time on the Midnight Express?" he asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. Eric nodded. "They say it's the fastest way to get where you're going," the old man continued, though his tone suggested an unspoken caveat. As the train lurched forward, Eric's unease deepened. The gentle hum of the engine was almost too quiet, as though the train were gliding on air rather than tracks. Outside the window, the station lights blurred into streaks of gold, and the surrounding countryside was swallowed by an impenetrable darkness. It was as if the train had left the world behind entirely. In the compartment ahead, a baby began to wail, the sound sharp and grating in the otherwise still air. The mother, a pale, hollow-eyed woman, whispered soothing words, but the cries only grew louder. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort mirrored in their faces. The businessman, who had been furiously typing on a laptop, snapped it shut with a scowl. Eric leaned back in his seat, trying to focus on the landscape outside. But there was nothing. No stars, no moon, no passing towns. Just an endless void pressing against the windows. He pulled out his notebook and began jotting down observations, hoping the act of writing would calm his nerves. "Train feels like a coffin," he scribbled, pausing to glance around the carriage. The thought made him shudder. At exactly midnight, the train's whistle let out a long, mournful wail, echoing through the carriages like a banshee's cry. The lights flickered violently, plunging the passengers into darkness for a heartbeat. When the glow returned, Eric noticed something that made his stomach twist. A seat that had been occupied moments ago was now empty, its previous passenger gone without a trace. No one else seemed to notice, or perhaps they chose not to. The Midnight Express moved deeper into the impenetrable darkness, the steady rhythm of its wheels a hollow echo in the vast void outside. Inside the carriage, passengers settled into uneasy silence. Eric couldn't shake the image of the empty seat. The woman who had occupied it. He remembered her distinctly, with her navy blue scarf and quiet demeanor, was gone. Her luggage, a small leather bag tucked beneath the seat, was missing too. It was as if she had never been there. Eric scanned the other passengers for any sign that someone else had noticed. The elderly man across the aisle remained engrossed in his newspaper, the pages crinkling softly in his trembling hands. The two sisters near the back were speaking in low voices, their faces pale in the dim light. Even the baby had stopped crying, the carriage now eerily still. The door to the next carriage slid open with a sharp hiss, breaking the silence. The conductor entered, his hollow gaze sweeping over the passengers like a searchlight. He moved slowly, his polished boots clicking against the floor. Eric noticed for the first time that the conductor carried no clipboard or ticket punch, only a small, ornate pocket watch, which he flipped open periodically. When the conductor reached Eric's row, he paused, his sunken eyes locked onto Eric's. And for a moment, Eric felt as if he were being stripped bare, every secret laid open. The conductor leaned in slightly, his voice low but piercing. "Do not stray from your seat," he said, his breath cold as frost. "And whatever you do, do not enter the fifth carriage." Before Eric could respond, the conductor moved on, his presence lingering like a shadow. Eric's pulse quickened. The warning was cryptic, but the weight of the conductor's words pressed heavily on him. Why the fifth carriage? What could possibly be there that warranted such caution? As the train sped onward, Eric's curiosity gnawed at him. He tried to distract himself by observing the passengers. Across the aisle, the elderly man had fallen asleep, his head lolling against the window. The two sisters were now staring straight ahead, their expressions blank, as if caught in some trance. Even the young woman with the fiery red hair, who had been flipping through her book earlier, now sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the floor. The oppressive stillness was broken by a sudden jolt. The train shuddered violently, and the lights flickered once more. Eric's notebook slid from his lap, landing on the floor with a thud. He bent to retrieve it, but as he did, he caught sight of something strange beneath the seat across from him. A piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, peeked out from under the sleeping man's chair. Curiosity overtook caution, and Eric reached for the paper. It was a train ticket, but not one for the Midnight Express. The date printed on it was from decades ago, and the destination was a town Eric had never heard of. The name of the passenger, faintly scrawled in ink, was illegible, the letters smudged as if by a trembling hand. Lost something? The conductor's voice was sudden, sharp, and too close for comfort. Eric flinched, clutching the ticket as he looked up. The conductor stood over him, his face as impassive as ever. Eric quickly stuffed the ticket into his pocket, mumbling an excuse about dropping his notebook. The conductor stared for a moment longer, then turned and continued down the aisle. Eric's heart raced as he sat back in his seat. The ticket felt like a burning coal in his pocket, its presence inexplicably heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the warning about the fifth carriage. The pieces didn't fit together yet, but Eric was determined to find out the truth. The train let out another mournful whistle as it plunged deeper into the night. Outside, the void seemed to press harder against the windows, an endless expanse of nothingness. Eric's thoughts swirled, his unease growing with every passing moment. The conductor's warning echoed in his mind like a dark mantra. He had every intention of following it, but something told him that before the journey was over, he would have no choice but to disobey. The Midnight Express carried on through the void, its passage a relentless rhythm that seemed both soothing and menacing. Eric tried to distract himself, alternating between jotting notes in his journal and staring into the featureless abyss outside the window. The world beyond the glass was as empty as his thoughts were chaotic, a perfect void that absorbed everything, even light. The pocket containing the mysterious train ticket seemed to grow heavier with each mile. Eric's fingers itched to pull it out again, to study its faded ink and brittle edges, but the memory of the conductor's piercing gaze stayed his hand. Something about that man's warning had burrowed into Eric's mind, a seed of dread that rooted deeper the more he tried to ignore it. The train jolted again, more violently this time. Several passengers gasped, clutching at their armrests. The young woman with the fiery red hair dropped her book, and one of the elderly sisters muttered a prayer under her breath. The lights flickered, not briefly, as before, but for an agonizingly long moment. When they stabilized, Eric was certain the train was moving faster. Eric turned to the window, hoping for a distraction, but the darkness outside had changed. It wasn't just empty anymore, it was moving. Shadows writhed and twisted, shapes that defied logic or explanation flickering just beyond the glass. He squinted, trying to make sense of them, but the harder he looked, the less clear they became. They weren't reflections, nor tricks of the light. They were something else. "Don't look too long," a voice whispered beside him. Eric turned sharply to find the elderly man across the aisle awake, his eyes clouded with fear. "They see when you look at them. Best to pretend you don't notice." "Who sees?" Eric asked, his voice low but urgent. The old man shook his head, his wrinkled hands gripping the armrests. "They don't have a name. Not anymore. Just don't let them know you're aware of them." Eric felt a chill creep up his spine. He turned back to the window, but kept his eyes unfocused, following the old man's advice. The shapes continued their restless dance, pressing against the glass as if testing its strength. He could hear faint whispers now, barely audible over the hum of the train. They weren't voices in any language he recognized, but they carried an unmistakable malice. The train shuddered once more, and Eric's attention snapped back to the carriage. A faint noise was coming from the far end, the fifth carriage. It was rhythmic, like the sound of something tapping against metal. None of the other passengers reacted, as if they couldn't hear it. Or perhaps they were choosing not to. Eric's curiosity was battling his growing sense of dread. He glanced around the carriage, noting that the conductor was nowhere in sight. The tapping sound grew louder, more insistent. He told himself it was probably nothing, a loose piece of machinery maybe. But deep down, he didn't believe that. The whispers outside the window grew louder, almost matching the tapping in rhythm. Eric's pulse quickened, his body torn between the primal urge to flee and the equally powerful compulsion to investigate. Against his better judgment, he rose from his seat. "You don't want to do that," the elderly man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay where you are. It's safer here." Eric hesitated, the man's words like an anchor holding him in place. But the sound from the fifth carriage grew louder still, a magnetic force pulling at his willpower. The whispers outside the window seemed to chant now, a sinister chorus urging him forward. With a final glance at the elderly man, Eric made his decision. He stepped into the aisle and began walking toward the source of the noise. The door to the next carriage loomed ahead, its frosted glass pane glowing faintly in the flickering light. Eric could feel every eye in the carriage on him as he approached, though no one said a word. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling. Somewhere behind him, the old man muttered, "God help you." Eric pushed the door open and stepped through, leaving the uneasy comfort of the carriage behind. The air grew colder as the door slid shut behind him, and the rhythmic tapping seemed to echo louder in the narrow passageway. He glanced down the length of the train, the corridor stretching endlessly before him. The shadows outside the windows pressed closer, their whispers now a cacophony. And yet, despite the fear clawing at his chest, Eric pressed on. Something waited ahead, something the Midnight Express was desperate to hide. The corridor beyond the door was colder than Eric expected, a sharp chill biting through his clothes as he stepped forward. The walls seemed narrower here, the dim overhead lights flickering with an unsettling rhythm. Each step he took felt amplified, the sound of his footsteps reverberating through the tight space. The tapping noise, faint at first, grew louder, more pronounced, as though it were beckoning him. Eric's eyes swept over the frost-coated windows, their panes streaked with patterns that looked unnervingly organic. Outside, the shadows still moved, but now they seemed more defined. They were humanoid, yet their forms were distorted, limbs twisting and stretching unnaturally. The whispers that accompanied them had shifted, no longer a chaotic cacophony, but an almost melodic chant, their tone thick with menace. He paused, turning to glance back at the door to the previous carriage. It felt miles away now, though he had only taken a dozen steps. The familiar hum of the Midnight Express seemed muted here, replaced by an oppressive silence that wrapped around him like a shroud. The door ahead, marked Carriage 5 in peeling, weathered paint, stood slightly ajar, its frosted glass pane clouded with condensation. Eric hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But the tapping sound was insistent, a rhythmic summons he couldn't ignore. Steeling himself, he approached the door and pushed it open. The air inside the fifth carriage was colder still, so cold it made Eric's breath visible. The scene before him was a stark contrast to the lively but subdued passengers he'd left behind. This carriage was empty, its rows of seats coated in frost, icicles dangling from the overhead luggage racks. The windows were completely opaque with ice, blocking out the shifting darkness beyond. As Eric stepped further in, his shoes crunching on the frost-covered floor, he noticed something peculiar. Scattered on the seats and the floor were objects, personal belongings that seemed to have been abandoned in a hurry. A knitted scarf lay draped over one seat, its fabric stiff with frost. A child's teddy bear, its button eyes eerily lifelike, sat upright in another. An overturned suitcase spilled its contents, a mix of outdated clothes and old-fashioned toiletries, onto the icy floor. And yet, there were no people. The tapping sound was louder here, emanating from somewhere toward the far end of the carriage. Eric moved cautiously, his eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to pool unnaturally in the corners of the space. The air was so cold now that his fingers began to ache, and he pulled his jacket tighter around him. As he neared the source of the tapping, Eric spotted something on one of the seats, a journal. Its leather cover was cracked and weathered, and it looked strangely out of place among the frozen chaos. He hesitated, then reached for it, the cold leather stiff against his fingers. Opening it to the first page, he found an inscription written in an elegant, flowing script. "To my dearest Margaret, may this journey bring us the peace we seek." Flipping through the pages, Eric saw frantic scrawls, the neat handwriting from the front giving way to disjointed, almost illegible notes. Words like shadows vanished, and cold forever leapt out at him, underlined multiple times. The final entry sent a chill through him. The conductor lied. Carriage 5 isn't empty. If you hear them, it's already too late. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on Eric like a physical weight. He froze, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The frost on the windows began to crackle, spiderweb patterns spreading across the glass. And then he heard it, a faint rustling sound like fabric brushing against fabric. It came from the shadows at the far end of the carriage. Slowly, too slowly, something began to emerge. It was humanoid in shape, but wrong in every possible way. Its elongated limbs moved unnaturally, joints bending in directions they shouldn't. Its face was featureless, a blank expanse of pale skin that seemed to shift and ripple like water. Eric stumbled back, the journal slipping from his hands and landing on the frozen floor with a dull thud. The creature turned its head, or what passed for its head, toward him, and though it had no eyes, Eric felt its gaze pierce through him. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent, a maddening chorus that filled his mind. He clutched at his ears, trying to block them out, but they were inside him now, a part of him. He turned and ran, slipping and stumbling on the icy floor, desperate to escape. As he reached the door, he risked a glance back. The creature hadn't moved, but the shadows around it writhed and twisted, as if alive. Eric didn't wait to see more. He flung the door open and bolted back into the corridor, slamming it shut behind him. The frost on his clothes began to melt as the warmth of the train returned, but the chill in his bones remained. He leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, the whispers still faintly echoing in his ears. The Midnight Express continued its journey through the void, its steady rhythm oblivious to the horrors it carried. But Eric knew now that the conductor's warning hadn't been enough. Whatever lay in Carriage 5 was far worse than he could have imagined. and he feared it wasn't content to stay confined to that frozen tomb. Eric's heart pounded as he stumbled back into the main corridor, the door to Carriage 5 now a frost-covered barrier between him and the horrors within. He pressed his back against the wall, willing his body to calm, but his hands trembled uncontrollably. The whispers, though muted, lingered at the edges of his consciousness, a haunting melody he couldn't fully escape. Taking a deep breath, he pushed himself upright and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The journal's cryptic warning echoed in his mind. The conductor lied. Carriage 5 isn't empty. Who was Margaret, and what peace were they seeking? More importantly, who or what had left those belongings scattered like breadcrumbs through the icy car? The hum of the train seemed louder now, its rhythm uneven, almost as though the Midnight Express itself had become unsettled. Eric considered returning to the observation car to confront the conductor, but a gnawing feeling in his gut told him he wouldn't find answers there. Instead, he decided to return to his seat and regroup. He needed time to think, to plan, to decide if continuing this journey was even an option. The train's warm air began to seep back into his limbs as he approached the rows of passengers, many still engrossed in their own worlds. Yet something felt off. The once muted conversations had fallen into an eerie hush. Heads were bowed, faces obscured by the brims of hats or the glow of dim reading lamps. No one looked up as Eric passed, their stillness unnerving in its uniformity. As he slid into his seat, he noticed the elderly woman across the aisle. Her knitting needles moved with mechanical precision, but the ball of yarn had unraveled completely, a tangled mess pooling at her feet. Eric leaned closer, about to speak, when he realized her hands weren't moving the needles. They were suspended mid-stitch, trembling slightly, as though frozen in time. Panic welled in his chest. He glanced around the carriage and noticed the same stillness in everyone else. A man in a bowler hat sat with a newspaper open before him, but the pages didn't turn, and his eyes were fixed, unblinking. A child gripping a toy train stared out the window, her lips parted in mid-word. Even the steward who had offered drinks earlier was frozen, tray in hand, the glass teetering on the edge. Eric shot to his feet, the overwhelming silence broken only by the sound of his chair creaking. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. No one responded. He reached out to the elderly woman, his hand hovering over her shoulder before he gently shook her. The moment his fingers brushed her cardigan, her head snapped toward him with inhuman speed, her eyes wide and filled with a black, swirling void. "You shouldn't have opened the door," she rasped, her voice layered with tones that seemed to echo from somewhere far away. Eric stumbled back, nearly falling into the aisle as the other passengers turned in unison. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, like puppets being yanked by invisible strings. Eric's breath caught in his throat as he backed away, his legs tangling in the narrow aisle. He turned to flee, but a figure blocked his path. It was the steward, his face pale and eyes lifeless. Yet his lips moved, forming a single chilling phrase. "Carriage 5 isn't the end. It's the beginning." The train lurched suddenly, throwing Eric off balance and sending him sprawling to the floor. The lights flickered violently, casting the frozen passengers in a strobe-like glow. The air grew thick with a metallic tang, and Eric's ears filled with a cacophony of overlapping whispers, each one louder and more desperate than the last. He crawled toward the nearest door, desperate to escape the encroaching terror. As he reached for the handle, the whispers coalesced into a single deafening roar. "You can't run from us." The door flew open, and Eric tumbled into the next carriage. He scrambled to his feet, slamming the door shut behind him. The whispers ceased abruptly, and he was plunged into an oppressive silence once more. This carriage was different. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces warped and uneven, reflecting distorted versions of himself. Each reflection moved slightly out of sync, their eyes flickering with an unnatural light. As Eric stood there, catching his breath, he realized the reflections weren't just imitating his movements. They were watching him. This was no ordinary train. This was a labyrinth of horrors, a journey designed to trap its passengers in a nightmare that defied all logic. And Eric was no longer certain he'd ever find his way out. Eric stared at the distorted mirrors lining the carriage walls, their warped surfaces twisting his image into grotesque, shifting shapes. His heart thundered in his chest as the reflections moved independently, some slower, others faster, but none in perfect sync with his trembling body. The oppressive silence wrapped around him like a noose, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. Taking a cautious step forward, he watched as his reflections responded. One image lagged behind, its movements sluggish as though trapped in molasses. Another darted ahead, moving too quickly, a manic grin stretching across its distorted face. Eric swallowed hard, his mouth dry as sandpaper. Were these reflections an illusion, or something far more sinister? The air in the carriage felt heavier with each step, thick and stifling, as if the train itself was suffocating him. He passed one mirror and noticed something peculiar. His reflection didn't mimic his expression of fear. Instead, it smiled, its teeth unnaturally white against the shadowy backdrop. Eric froze, his gaze locking with a mirrored version of himself. "Why are you running?" the reflection asked, its voice muffled as though coming from underwater. Eric stumbled back, his spine pressing against the opposite mirror. "This isn't real," he muttered, clutching his head in disbelief. "None of this is real." The reflections began to shift more violently, each one adopting a different demeanor. Some laughed silently, their shoulders shaking with sinister glee. Others stared at him with dead eyes, their expressions devoid of humanity. One pressed its hands against the inside of the glass, as though it might break through and join him. Eric tried to focus, his mind racing for an explanation. He thought of the journal, the cryptic warnings scribbled in its pages. The conductor lied. The phrase replayed in his head like a mantra. But what was the lie? Was this all part of the Midnight Express's dark design? As he inched forward, the mirrors began to hum, a low vibration that sent shivers through his body. With each step, the hum grew louder, morphing into an eerie, melodic chant. It was a sound unlike any he'd ever heard, an unsettling harmony of dissonance and despair. He covered his ears, but the sound pierced through, relentless and unyielding. Suddenly, one of the mirrors cracked, the fissure spreading like a spiderweb. From within the cracks, a black liquid seeped out, pooling at Eric's feet. The other mirrors followed suit, their surfaces shattering as the same viscous substance poured into the carriage. The air grew colder, and the liquid began to writhe, forming shapes that rose from the floor like living shadows. Eric's breath hitched as the shadowy forms took on human-like silhouettes. They moved without sound, gliding toward him with unsettling grace. Their faces were featureless voids, yet he felt their gaze boring into him, stripping him of all defenses. He turned to flee, but the door he'd come through was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of mirrors. Panic surged as he tried to claw at the surface, his reflection mimicking his desperation but offering no escape. Behind him, the shadow figures drew closer, their presence pressing against his senses like a vice. Eric whirled around, his back against the cold glass. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the unnatural stillness. The shadows halted, their heads tilting in unison as if considering his question. Then, in a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from every direction, they replied, "Truth." Before Eric could respond, the floor beneath him buckled, and he was pulled into a void of darkness. The sensation was disorienting, like falling and being crushed at the same time. When he landed, the world was no longer black, but bathed in a dim, flickering light. He was in another carriage, this one lined with hundreds of photographs. Each photo depicted the same train, the Midnight Express, but with subtle differences. Some showed passengers smiling, others staring blankly. In some, the train appeared pristine, while in others, it was in various states of decay. Eric stepped closer to inspect one photo and froze. There he was, standing among the other passengers, but his face was wrong. His eyes were dark pits, and his mouth was twisted into a horrific grin. A chill ran down his spine as a single thought crystallized in his mind. The Midnight Express wasn't just a train. It was a trap, a living nightmare feeding on its passengers. And it wasn't done with him yet. Eric stood frozen, his gaze locked on the photograph that depicted him among the passengers. It was unmistakably him, his face, his posture, but the expression was alien, grotesque. The eyes, black and hollow, seemed to peer out from the image, as if they were watching him instead of the other way around. The sinister grin stretched far beyond the limits of what a human face should manage, creating a caricature of malevolence. His heart raced as he backed away, but the photographs seemed to multiply. Each step brought new images into view, lining the walls, floor, and ceiling of the dimly lit carriage. Every photo depicted a variation of the Midnight Express and its passengers. Some were serene, showing the train bathed in sunlight as travelers sipped tea and laughed. Others were nightmarish, capturing scenes of chaos and horror. Passengers clawing at windows, faces distorted in silent screams, and shadowy figures emerging from the walls. Eric's hands trembled as he reached for another photo, his curiosity battling with his fear. This one was different. It showed a group of passengers gathered in the dining car, but their faces were blurred, as though erased by some unseen force. In the background, barely visible, stood a tall figure in a conductor's uniform. Unlike the others, its face was clear, a pale mask with empty sockets where eyes should have been. A sudden noise broke the oppressive silence. A faint clicking sound, rhythmic and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock. Eric turned sharply, his eyes scanning the room. The sound grew louder, closer, until it felt as though it was right behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Looking for something, a voice rasped. Eric nearly jumped out of his skin, his head snapping toward the source. A figure stood at the far end of the carriage, shrouded in the flickering shadows cast by the dim lights. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its posture unnaturally stiff. The face was obscured by a conductor's hat, tilted low enough to cast the upper half of its face in darkness. "Who are you?" Eric demanded, his voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by the question. "The better question," it replied, "is who are you?" Before Eric could respond, the figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, like a puppet on frayed strings. As it approached, the photographs around him began to change. The once static images now moved, their subjects shifting and writhing. In one photo, a woman banged her fists against the glass of her window, her mouth open in a silent scream. In another, a man stood in the corridor, his body dissolving into black mist. Eric tried to move, but his legs felt leaden, as though the train itself was holding him in place. The figure stopped a few feet away, close enough for Eric to make out its face. The hat tilted back slightly, revealing pale, featureless skin. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, blank canvas. "What do you want from me?" Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure raised a hand, its fingers unnaturally long and pointed. It gestured toward one of the photographs, and Eric's stomach churned as he saw the image shift to show himself once more. This time, he was seated in the train's observation car, his face a mask of despair. Behind him, shadows crept along the walls, their shapes forming grotesque, leering faces. "You boarded this train seeking answers," the figure said, its voice echoing as though it came from all around. "But answers come at a price." Eric's mind raced, the figure's words only deepening his confusion. "What price? I didn't ask for this." The figure's blank face somehow conveyed disdain. "You didn't ask with words, but your soul screamed for it. Desperation is louder than you realize." Suddenly, the floor beneath Eric shifted, the sensation like standing on the deck of a ship in a storm. The photographs around him blurred, their images melting into one another. The figure extended its hand toward him, and Eric felt a pull, as if the very air was dragging him forward. He stumbled, reaching out for something, anything, to steady himself. His hand brushed against a photograph, and the instant his fingers made contact, the world around him dissolved into darkness. Eric blinked, his heart pounding as he found himself standing in a new carriage. This one was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. The walls were lined not with mirrors or photographs, but with doors. Each door was marked with a name, though the lettering was faded and difficult to read. Behind him, the conductor's voice echoed one final time. "Choose wisely, traveler." Some doors lead forward, others lead nowhere at all. Eric turned, but the figure was gone, leaving him alone in this strange, foreboding place. The doors stretched endlessly in both directions, and as he approached the nearest one, he saw his own name etched faintly into the wood. Eric hesitated before the door bearing his name, his breath caught in his chest. The wood looked old and warped, as though it had weathered centuries of storms. The letters carved into its surface seemed to shift under his gaze, as if mocking his uncertainty. Behind him, the other doors stretched into an endless, shadowed expanse, their faded names barely visible. Each represented a decision, but none offered any clues about what lay beyond. He placed his hand on the doorknob, its cold metal sending a shiver up his arm. A faint hum resonated from within the door, a vibration that felt alive. Eric closed his eyes and twisted the handle, bracing himself for whatever horrors awaited. The door creaked open, revealing not the confines of a train carriage, but a sprawling field bathed in twilight. Stepping through, Eric was struck by the stillness. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp grass and distant rain. In the center of the field stood a single tree, its twisted branches reaching skyward like skeletal hands. Beneath it, a figure sat motionless, cloaked in shadows. Eric's heart thudded in his chest as he approached, each step muffled by the soft ground. As he drew closer, the figure became clearer. It was a young boy, no older than 8, dressed in tattered clothes. His head was bowed, his hands clutching a small object. Eric called out, his voice trembling. "Hello? Are you all right?" The boy lifted his head, revealing pale, tear-streaked cheeks and hollow eyes that seemed far too old for his face. "You shouldn't have come here," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eric knelt beside him, trying to ignore the growing unease curling in his stomach. "What do you mean? Where is this place?" The boy extended his hands, revealing the object he had been clutching, a pocket watch. Its face was cracked, the hands spinning erratically. "This is where time breaks," the boy said, his gaze locked on the watch. "Everyone who comes here gets lost, and once you're lost, you can't leave." Eric felt a chill crawl up his spine. "But I didn't mean to come here. I didn't choose this place." The boy finally looked up, his hollow eyes meeting Eric's. "You always choose, even when you don't realize it." Before Eric could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The tree's twisted branches shook violently, and the sky darkened, as if some unseen force was drawing the light away. The boy clutched the pocket watch tightly, his small frame trembling. "It's coming," he whispered, his voice filled with dread. Eric turned to see the horizon rippling, like a reflection on disturbed water. From the distortion emerged a massive shadow, its form shifting and unsteady. It had no discernible features, only a void-like presence that radiated malevolence. The boy grabbed Eric's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "We have to go back. Now!" Together, they ran toward the door Eric had entered through, but it was no longer there. In its place was another door, smaller and covered in rust. Eric reached for the handle, but the boy pulled him back. "Not that one," he cried. "That's how it gets you." Eric hesitated, panic clawing at his chest. The shadow was closing in, its presence suffocating. He glanced around desperately, spotting another door a few paces away. This one was pristine, its surface smooth and polished. Without thinking, Eric grabbed the boy's hand and dragged him toward it. The moment he touched the door, the field disappeared, replaced by the dimly lit train corridor. Eric stumbled forward, his breath ragged. The boy was gone, and in his hand, he clutched the cracked pocket watch. He turned back to see the door he had entered through, but it was no longer there. Instead, the corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, the air thick with the scent of smoke. The faint echo of footsteps reached his ears, and a voice, cold and mocking, whispered from the shadows, "You're learning, Eric. But there's so much further to go." Clutching the pocket watch, Eric pressed onward, the endless corridor beckoning him into the unknown. The corridor stretched out before Eric, an infinite expanse of dimly lit train interiors that seemed to shimmer like a mirage. Every few steps, the walls groaned as though alive, shifting slightly in response to his presence. The cracked pocket watch in his hand emitted a faint, erratic ticking, a sound that unnerved him with its inconsistency. He clenched it tightly, afraid to let go yet dreading what it represented, a tie to the unsettling truths of wherever he now stood. The faint echo of footsteps in the distance kept him moving forward. It wasn't clear whether they were coming closer or merely taunting him from afar. The air was thick, heavy with the acrid scent of smoke that seemed to seep from the seams of the walls. Eric's breaths grew shallow as he advanced, each step feeling like a trespass into a forbidden realm. Suddenly, he reached a break in the corridor. To his left, a set of ornate double doors loomed, their brass handles polished to an unnerving gleam. A soft light spilled out from underneath them, flickering like candlelight. The door's surface reflected his distorted image, the contours of his face twisting in unnatural ways. On the right, a simple wooden door stood slightly ajar, revealing a darkened room beyond. No light escaped it, only a palpable sense of emptiness. Eric paused, torn between the two paths. The ornate doors seemed to promise answers, or traps. The darkened doorway, however, called to him in a different way, as though it had been waiting for him all along. As he deliberated, a familiar voice echoed behind him, low and lilting. "Eric, you don't belong here." He spun around, but the corridor was empty. Still, the voice persisted, this time closer. "You've seen too much already. Why make it worse?" "Who's there?" Eric demanded, his voice trembling. The silence that followed was almost worse than the voice itself. His grip tightened around the pocket watch, the ticking growing louder and faster, as if urging him to act. Without fully deciding, Eric pushed open the ornate double doors. They gave way with a groan, revealing a grand dining car bathed in a warm, golden glow. A long table stretched down the center, laden with untouched plates of food, roast meats, fresh fruits, delicate pastries, all of it impossibly pristine. Around the table sat passengers, their faces oddly blurred, their movements mechanical as they raised empty forks to unseen mouths. Eric stepped forward cautiously, his presence unnoticed by the diners. The faint hum of a violin played somewhere in the distance, an ethereal tune that seemed to curl into his mind and linger. At the far end of the table sat a figure shrouded in shadows, their head bowed as though in contemplation. "Eric." The figure's voice was both familiar and foreign, a haunting blend of tones that made his skin crawl. "You've come further than most. Who are you?" Eric asked, his voice barely audible over the hypnotic violin. The figure raised its head, revealing a face that stopped Eric cold. It was his own. Or rather, it was an older version of himself, the eyes hollow and filled with a wisdom born of suffering. The older Eric gestured to the empty chair across from him, and the motion caused the other diners to suddenly freeze in place. "Sit," the figure commanded. "We need to talk." Eric hesitated but complied, the chair creaking under his weight. As he sat, the food on the table began to spoil before his eyes, turning gray and crumbling into dust. The violin ceased abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. "You're at a crossroads," the older Eric said, leaning forward. His face was weathered, lined with scars that hadn't yet appeared on Eric's younger visage. "This place isn't just a train. It's a vessel, a bridge between what you think is real and what actually is." "What do you mean?" Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The older Eric smirked, a bitter expression. "You've been making choices, Eric. Some you understand, some you don't. But every step you take brings you closer to something something you can't turn back from. Eric opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of splintering would cut him off. He turned just in time to see the darkened door from the corridor materializing behind him, its edges glowing with an ominous red light. The older Eric stood abruptly, his expression grave. "You have to make a decision now," he said. "Do you keep moving forward, or do you turn back and face what's chasing you?" Before Eric could answer, the door burst open, flooding the room with darkness. Something moved within it, a shadowed form that radiated a malevolent energy. The diners dissolved into ash, their blurred faces erased in an instant. The older Eric grabbed his wrist, shoving the pocket watch into his hand. "Time's running out," he hissed. "Choose." Eric stood paralyzed as the darkness loomed closer, the ticking of the watch growing deafening. Finally, with a surge of desperation, he ran, not toward the darkened door, but back into the corridor, leaving the older version of himself and the grand dining car behind. The train swallowed him once more, the air thick with smoke and uncertainty. But the question lingered. Had he chosen wisely, or merely delayed the inevitable? The corridor seemed endless, its dim light shifting like ripples on water. Eric's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he ran. The pocket watch, now glowing faintly, swung in his grip, the ticking a relentless metronome of dread. Each step echoed with a hollow resonance, the train's interior distorting around him like a fever dream. As he slowed to catch his breath, he noticed the walls were no longer the same tarnished metal he had grown accustomed to. Instead, they appeared to be paneled with dark wood, polished to an unnatural shine. Strange symbols were etched into the surface, their lines shifting subtly as though alive. The air was thicker here, heavy with the scent of damp earth and burning candles. Eric stopped before a window. The view outside offered no solace. The dark, starless void was gone, replaced by a dense, swirling mist. Shapes flitted through it, figures that seemed human but moved in ways that defied anatomy. He stepped back from the glass, his stomach churning. The corridor opened into another car, this one resembling a grand library. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with books of all sizes and ages. Some were bound in cracked leather, others in materials Eric couldn't identify. A solitary desk sat in the center, its surface cluttered with yellowed papers, an ink pot, and a single lit candle. The light flickered unnaturally, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Eric hesitated before stepping inside, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The air here was quieter, almost reverent, but not comforting. As he approached the desk, the pages on it seemed to rearrange themselves, forming words in a language he didn't recognize. Despite their foreign appearance, he understood them intuitively. What you write becomes real. Eric frowned, his fingers brushing the edge of the desk. A quill lay beside the ink pot, its tip stained dark red. A fresh sheet of paper appeared before him as though summoned by his presence. The train groaned, its voice a low, guttural warning, but Eric couldn't look away from the paper. His hand trembled as he picked up the quill. He wasn't sure why he did it, only that it felt inevitable, like turning the page of a book in which he was the protagonist. The moment the quill touched the paper, the ink spread like blood, forming a single word. Choose. The pocket watch in his hand began ticking faster, the sound rising to a frantic tempo. Eric glanced around, half expecting the older version of himself to materialize and offer cryptic advice. Instead, the shelves began to move. Books slid out and fell to the floor, their pages flipping wildly as if caught in an invisible wind. Whispers filled the air, voices speaking in unison but out of sync, their words fragmented and unintelligible. Eric gritted his teeth and wrote a single word on the paper: escape. The train reacted immediately. The walls shuddered, the floor trembling beneath his feet. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their words finally coalescing into a single phrase: there is no escape. Before Eric could react, the desk split down the middle, revealing a gaping void. The suction was immediate and powerful, pulling the books, the papers, and the quill into its dark maw. Eric clung to the edge of the nearest shelf, the pocket watch slipping from his grasp and disappearing into the void. The moment the watch was gone, the void closed, leaving the room eerily silent. Eric collapsed to the floor, his heart pounding. The library was untouched, the desk whole once more, as if nothing had happened. Yet the absence of the pocket watch left an ache in his chest. He stood shakily, forcing himself to move toward the next door. As he reached for the handle, a voice whispered behind him, chillingly close. "Careful what you write next, Eric." He spun around, but the room was empty. The door creaked open under his hand, revealing another corridor, darker and narrower than before. He stepped through, the air behind him filling with a cold, mocking laughter. Eric walked on, the train tightening its grip on him with every step. The narrow corridor stretched endlessly before Eric, suffocating in its oppressive darkness. The walls seemed to close in as he walked, their surfaces now riddled with claw marks and cracks that oozed a viscous, black substance. Each step he took was accompanied by the faint sound of whispers, low, guttural murmurs that teased the edges of his sanity. The air was frigid, biting at his skin and numbing his fingers. Yet, despite the cold, a thin sheen of sweat coated his brow. Eric's heartbeat thundered in his ears, the rhythm a stark contrast to the almost imperceptible hum of the train. Every few steps, the floor beneath him would creak and groan, as though the train itself were alive, watching his every move. Eric reached a door at the end of the corridor, its surface an ornate mosaic of images and symbols. As he examined it, the images shifted and morphed, depicting scenes he couldn't quite comprehend. One moment, he saw a dense forest, shrouded in mist. The next, a sprawling city burning under a blood-red sky. His hand hesitated on the handle, but an unshakable force compelled him to turn it. The door opened to reveal a vast chamber that defied the train's physical limits. The room was circular, its walls lined with mirrors of varying shapes and sizes. Each mirror reflected a distorted version of Eric. Some older, some younger, some barely human. The floor was a polished black surface that mirrored the ceiling, where an intricate constellation of stars sparkled. Eric stepped into the room, his reflection multiplying infinitely in the mirrors. As he moved, the reflections moved with him, but not in perfect sync. Some turned to face him, their eyes hollow and accusing. Others walked ahead or lagged behind, their movements jerky and unnatural. One by one, the mirrors began to crack, the sound sharp and jarring in the eerie silence. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, upon which rested an object that made Eric's breath catch. A book bound in dark leather, its surface pulsating faintly as though alive. The title was etched in gold, Passengers of the Abyss. Eric approached the book cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He reached out to touch it, but the moment his fingers brushed the cover, the mirrors around him shattered in unison. Shards of glass rained down, but instead of falling to the floor, they hovered mid-air, forming a swirling vortex around him. The shards began to show images, memories, but not all of them his own. He saw glimpses of strangers, a woman cradling a child as fire consumed their home, a man staring into the abyss of a forest, and an elderly figure standing in the middle of a desolate battlefield. Each scene was brief, but the pain and despair in them were palpable. A voice echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant, vibrating in Eric's chest. The train collects them all, those who linger too long, who seek what cannot be found. You are no different. Eric spun around, but there was no source for the voice. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Who are you? He demanded, his voice cracking. You know who we are, the voice replied. We are the echoes of the lost, the remnants of choices made and unmade. And now, you are one of us. The shards began to close in, pressing against his skin without cutting. He felt their cold weight as they embedded themselves into him, merging with his body. Pain seared through him, but with it came a flood of memories, not just his own, but countless others. The voices of the lost filled his mind, their despair intertwining with his own thoughts. As the last shard merged into his chest, Eric collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The book on the pedestal opened on its own, its pages flipping rapidly before settling on a single word: bound. The room dissolved into darkness, leaving Eric alone with the echoes of the lost, their whispers now part of his own thoughts. He stood, trembling, and staggered back toward the door he had entered. As he stepped through, the train seemed to sigh, its oppressive presence growing heavier. Eric knew the train had claimed another piece of him, but he also knew he couldn't stop. Whatever awaited in the next car, he had to face it. He was no longer just a passenger. He was part of the train's twisted essence now. The door groaned open as Eric stumbled into the next car. This space bore no resemblance to anything he had seen so far. Gone were the distorted corridors and surreal chambers. Instead, he found himself in a modestly lit office that exuded a disquieting normalcy. A single desk, carved from rich mahogany, dominated the center of the room. Behind it sat a figure in a pristine conductor's uniform, his face obscured by the brim of his cap and the deep shadows that pooled beneath it. The man, or whatever he was, radiated an authority that made Eric's breath catch. His presence was neither overtly threatening nor welcoming. It simply demanded acknowledgement. The air around him seemed to ripple faintly, as if reality itself bent to accommodate him. On the desk lay a massive ledger, its edges frayed and its cover inscribed with the train's emblem, a serpent devouring its own tail. The conductor gestured for Eric to sit. Eric hesitated, but found himself complying, sinking into the chair before the desk. His muscles felt leaden, his body moving almost against his will. Eric Rhodes, the conductor began, his voice calm yet weighty, like a distant storm rolling across an empty plain. You've come farther than most. Few passengers reach this car. Eric clenched his fists to steady his nerves. Who are you? What is this place? Why am I here? The conductor tilted his head slightly, the shadow over his face deepening. I am the ledger keeper. This train is a journey between what was and what could be. And you, Eric, are a passenger of great interest. The conductor opened the ledger with a deliberate motion. Its pages were filled with names, dates, and cryptic annotations written in a language Eric couldn't decipher. He saw his own name near the top of one page, the ink still wet. Beneath, it was a series of symbols he didn't understand, but he felt their meaning in his gut, bound by echoes, fractured by choice. Eric's stomach twisted. Why am I in that book? What does it mean? The conductor tapped a gloved finger against the page. Everyone who steps aboard the train becomes part of the ledger. It records your life, your decisions, your regrets. Every choice shapes your journey, and every regret feeds the train. Eric's mind raced. Feeds the train? What are you talking about? Your sorrow, your fear, your indecision, it sustains this place, the conductor said. The train is a liminal space, drawn to those who cannot let go. You boarded because you were searching for something, were you not? Eric thought of the pocket watch, of the older version of himself, and the haunting visions that had plagued him since he first woke up on this nightmare of a train. He nodded reluctantly. I wanted to understand everything. My future, my past. I wanted answers. The conductor closed the ledger, the sound reverberating like a distant thunderclap. And in seeking those answers, you've trapped yourself here. But you are not beyond salvation. Yet, the room began to shift. The walls creaked as faint, glowing cracks formed, revealing glimpses of other passengers in other cars. A child crying in a dilapidated cabin. An elderly woman pacing a hallway lined with endless doors. A man staring at a noose hanging from the ceiling of his compartment. Eric's breath quickened. Who are they? What's happening to them? They are passengers, like you, the conductor said. Each is bound by their own regrets, their own unresolved pasts. They will remain until the train has taken all it can from them, or until they find the strength to leave. Eric stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. And how do I leave? Tell me. The conductor's gaze bore into him, though his eyes remained unseen. That is not for me to decide, but be warned. The choices you make from this moment forward will either free you or bind you here forever. And not all who seek freedom find it. Before Eric could respond, the cracks in the walls widened, and the room began to dissolve. The desk, the ledger, and the conductor faded into swirling shadows. The air grew heavier, suffused with the faint scent of smoke and rust. Eric was standing again in a narrow corridor, its walls warped and pulsing. In his hand, he now held the ledger. It was smaller than before, its cover warm to the touch and humming faintly with life. The pages inside were blank, save for the first, which bore a single line of text: "Write your truth, or the train will write it for you." Eric stared at the book, his hands trembling. The train groaned beneath him, as if impatient for his decision. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of laughter echoed, growing louder with each passing second. With nowhere else to turn, Eric stepped forward, clutching the ledger tightly, knowing that whatever lay ahead would demand more of him than he had ever imagined. Eric stumbled down the corridor, the conductor's words reverberating in his mind. "Write your truth, or the train will write it for you." The weight of the ledger in his hand felt almost unbearable, as if the slim book carried the memories of all who had ever passed through this cursed train. The laughter he'd heard moments before now seemed to mock him, growing louder and more distorted with every step. The corridor led him to a new car, its door cracked slightly ajar. The moment he pushed it open, a wave of freezing air rushed past him, prickling his skin. Inside, the room resembled a decayed ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung crookedly, their lights flickering like dying stars. The floor was covered in blackened tiles, many of which were cracked or missing. Tables and chairs were scattered chaotically, some overturned, others eerily pristine. The most disturbing feature of the room, however, was the crowd. Dozens of figures stood motionless, their backs turned to him. They wore formal attire, ball gowns, tuxedos, and suits that seemed frozen in time, their fabrics stained and frayed. Eric hesitated, sensing that something about these figures was profoundly wrong. As he stepped further into the room, the figures began to turn toward him, one by one. Their faces were blank, smooth surfaces where eyes, noses, and mouths should have been. Yet, despite their facelessness, Eric could feel their gaze piercing through him, weighing him down with the silent pressure of their judgment. "Who are you?" Eric asked, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" One figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, as if it had to fight against invisible strings controlling its limbs. When it spoke, its voice emerged not from any mouth, but from the air itself, a chorus of whispers layered over a single, hollow tone. "We are passengers," it said. "Like you, bound by choices, chained by regret." Eric's grip on the ledger tightened. "Then why are you here? Why haven't you left?" Another figure spoke, its voice blending with the first, creating a disorienting echo. "We could not let go. The ledger demands truth, but truth requires courage. We were not strong enough to face what we buried." Eric felt a chill crawl up his spine. He opened the ledger, hoping to find some guidance, but the pages were still blank. He turned to the faceless figures. "What truth? What am I supposed to write?" A third figure stepped closer, its movements slower but more deliberate. "The truth that binds you to this place. The moment you broke yourself. The choice you fear to face." Eric's mind raced, flashes of his life surfacing against his will. He thought of his failed relationships, his estranged family, the career he had walked away from. Yet one memory hovered above the rest, a shadow he could never fully escape. He forced it back, unwilling to confront it here. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I don't even know what that truth is. I didn't ask to be here. I just want to get off this train." The crowd of figures moved as one, encircling him. Their presence was suffocating, their silence louder than any scream. The whispers began again, but this time they spoke directly into his mind, fragments of sentences that made no sense yet cut deep. "Why did you let her go? You could have saved him. Do you remember the screams? You never even looked back." Eric dropped the ledger, clutching his ears as the voices grew louder. "Stop it. I don't know what you're talking about." The lead figure bent down and picked up the ledger, holding it out to him. its blank face tilted toward him as it spoke. "You do know, but you are afraid to write it. This train will keep you until you choose. If you will not face your truth, it will face you." The ballroom trembled, cracks spreading across the floor as the chandelier above shattered, raining shards of glass down on the faceless crowd. Yet they did not flinch, their attention locked on Eric. A new door appeared at the far end of the room, its frame glowing faintly. The whispers fell silent as the figure placed the ledger back into Eric's hands. "The next car awaits," it said. "But know this, the longer you delay, the harder it will be to leave. The ledger is patient, but the train is not." The faceless figures stepped aside, creating a narrow path to the glowing door. Eric hesitated, his mind a storm of fear and uncertainty. Finally, clutching the ledger close, he stepped forward, the crowd parting silently around him. As he passed through the door, the laughter returned, louder and more menacing than before. It followed him into the next car, where a darkness thicker than any he'd encountered before awaited. For the first time since this journey began, Eric felt the train's hunger, and he knew it was watching him. The door slammed shut behind Eric, and the laughter ceased as abruptly as it had begun. He was plunged into darkness so absolute, it felt as though even his thoughts were swallowed by it. His breath quickened as his eyes strained to adjust, but the blackness remained impenetrable, offering no comfort, no direction. For a moment, he wondered if the train had somehow swallowed him whole, reduced to nothing but an endless void. He reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing against the cold, metal walls of the car. The sensation grounded him. Barely, but it was enough to remind him that he was not alone in this suffocating space. There was something in the darkness, something watching him, but he could not bring himself to turn and confront it. "Is this another test?" he whispered into the void, his voice weak and swallowed by the shadows. No response, only silence. Eric took a step forward, then another. He had learned not to wait for answers in this place. The train, the conductor, the faceless passengers, none of them offered him clarity. They merely pushed him forward, urging him to confront his fears, to come face to face with the choices that had brought him here. And yet, the further he moved through the oppressive blackness, the more he felt a sense of déjà vu, as though he had already walked this path, faced this moment before. The tension in his chest grew with each step. Was this another form of the past? A memory that had trapped him in this cycle? The possibility gnawed at him. Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the distance. At first, it was just a pinprick, a weak glimmer like a distant star, but it steadily grew brighter as he moved toward it. Soon, it took shape, a narrow window through which pale light spilled, revealing what looked like a hallway beyond. It was stark and sterile, with walls of polished white tiles and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. He approached it cautiously, his hand shaking as he pushed open the door. The room he entered was vastly different from the others. It felt almost mundane, as if it belonged to another world entirely. There were no strange passengers, no haunting reflections, no sinister atmosphere. Instead, it was a small office, its walls lined with cabinets and a desk cluttered with papers. At the center of the room sat a figure, but not the conductor. This figure was human, or at least appeared to be. A middle-aged man in a plain suit, his tie loosened slightly as though he had been working for hours. He looked up as Eric entered, offering him a friendly smile, though his eyes held an unsettlingly knowing look. "Ah, Eric," the man said, his voice calm and reassuring. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Eric froze. "Who are you?" The man's smile never wavered. "I'm someone who knows all about you. And more importantly, I know what you're running from." Eric's heart skipped a beat. "I'm not running from anything." The man leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together on the desk. "You've been running from yourself for a long time, Eric. But that ends now." The words hit Eric like a punch to the gut. He wanted to deny it, wanted to scream at the man for suggesting such an absurdity. But deep down, he knew it was true. He had never been able to face the parts of himself that he despised, the failures, the disappointments, the things he had done and left undone. "Do you remember her?" The man continued, his voice growing colder. The one you abandoned? The one who trusted you, believed in you, loved you, until you broke her. Eric recoiled, the memories flooding back in a rush. The girl he had left behind all those years ago, the one he'd promised to love forever, only to walk away when things got tough. Her face, her tears, the betrayal she must have felt. His chest tightened painfully, and for a moment, he could barely breathe. "You think you're here by accident," the man said softly, his gaze never leaving Eric's face. "But you've always known. This train has been waiting for you to face what you've done. To face her." Eric shook his head, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of the man's words. I can't go back. I can't fix it. I can't fix what I've ruined." The man smiled again, but this time, it wasn't comforting. It was the smile of someone who knew the truth of the world that Eric had always tried to ignore. "You don't have to fix anything, Eric. You only need to accept what you've done. Accept the truth." Eric clenched his fists, fighting against the tears that threatened to spill. "And then what? What happens after I accept it?" The man's expression softened, almost pitying. "Then the train will stop. The choices that bind you here will be undone. But the question is, Eric, will you face your truth, or will you run again?" Eric didn't answer. He didn't know if he could. Part of him wanted to turn away, to keep running as he always had. But another part, the part that had been buried beneath all the pain and regret, was tired. Tired of hiding, tired of pretending that he could outrun himself forever. The man stood, his smile fading into something more solemn. "The choice is yours, Eric. You can leave this room, but know that if you do, the train will keep going. And next time, it may not stop for you." With that, the man turned his back to Eric, walking toward a door that had appeared at the far end of the room. Without another word, he opened it and stepped through. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Eric alone with his thoughts. For a long moment, Eric stood in the center of the room, the ledger still gripped tightly in his hands. The weight of it felt heavier than ever, as though it held all the answers to questions he hadn't yet dared to ask. Eric stood motionless in the sterile office, the lingering words of the mysterious man echoing in his mind. He had spent so much time running, avoiding confrontation with his past, that the idea of facing it head-on seemed almost foreign to him. The room felt colder now, and the silence, which had once been a comfort, now pressed down on him, urging him to make a decision. The decision. He could leave, continue his journey on the train, and pretend that nothing had changed. Or he could step forward, into the unknown, and face the consequences of his actions. But what were the consequences? He had never thought about it. His mind had been too clouded by distractions, by the desire to escape the guilt and shame that had been his constant companions. He thought of the girl, the one he had abandoned. Her face haunted him, and he realized with a painful clarity that he had never truly let her go. Not in the way he had believed. Every relationship, every choice had been tainted by his failure to confront his past. The weight of his indecision pressed down on him, and he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. If he stayed here, in this room, he knew the man's words would continue to reverberate, asking him to face the truth, to reckon with the harm he had done. But if he left, if he chose to continue on the train, he knew there would be no turning back. He would be running, as he always had. It was the same choice he had made years ago. The choice to walk away, to ignore the pain he had caused, to pretend it wasn't his problem. The same choice that had brought him to this point, to this train, to this dark place where the past and present collided in a disorienting whirl of uncertainty. The door at the far end of the room remained slightly ajar, a faint light spilling from it, offering a glimpse of the world beyond. The man who had spoken to him was gone, leaving only the soft hum of the train and the echo of his words. But Eric knew that leaving this room would mean more than just physically walking out. It would mean continuing the same cycle, the same self-deception that had gotten him here in the first place. Eric took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He was terrified of what might happen if he made the wrong choice, if he faced the truth and it consumed him. But what was the alternative? To remain trapped in this never-ending loop of guilt and regret. To let the weight of his past destroy him, piece by piece. He stepped toward the door, the soft light now blinding him as he crossed the threshold. The hallway beyond seemed endless, stretching far into the distance, its walls closing in on him. There was no turning back now. He had made his choice. He had to face whatever came next. The hallway was eerily silent, and for a moment, Eric wondered if the train had stopped completely. But no, the rhythmic sound of the tracks beneath the train's wheels continued, steady and unrelenting. He could hear the hum of the overhead lights, the distant murmur of other passengers. But it was all muffled, as though the world outside had faded away, leaving only him and his choices. As he walked down the hallway, he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. His skin prickled, and he quickened his pace, the sound of his footsteps now echoing off the walls. But no matter how fast he moved, the feeling of being pursued never left him. He had always thought of himself as strong, capable of outrunning his mistakes. But now, for the first time, he felt the weight of his decisions catching up to him. The hallway finally opened into a small, dimly lit cabin. Inside, a single passenger sat by the window, staring out at the endless darkness. The man appeared ordinary, an older gentleman in a well-worn coat, his face lined with age and experience. But there was something unsettling about him, something in the way he sat, unmoving, as though he had been waiting for Eric to arrive. Eric hesitated at the doorway. Something about the man's presence seemed too deliberate, too calculated. Was this another test? Another illusion? Or was this the next step in confronting his past? The man turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Eric's with a chilling intensity. "You've come," the man said simply, his voice deep and gravelly. "I knew you would." Eric opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat tightened, and for the first time since stepping onto the train, he felt truly afraid. The man's smile was unsettling, as though he found some dark amusement in Eric's discomfort. "You think you have a choice, don't you? That you can run from the past, that you can outrun your mistakes. But the truth is, Eric, there's no place for you to hide. No matter where you go, no matter how fast you run, you will always come back here." Eric felt his pulse race as the man's words sank in. Was this the end of the road? Was there truly no escape from his past? He had always believed that if he kept moving, if he kept changing, he could outrun the ghosts of his mistakes. But now, with this man's gaze fixed on him, it was impossible to deny the truth. His past had followed him, and it was demanding to be faced. The man stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Eric's. "It's time to stop running," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It's time to face the cost of your choices. And there will be a cost, Eric. There always is." Eric swallowed hard, the fear rising in his chest. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him again, heavier than ever. He had made it this far, but how much further could he go? How much longer could he run before the cost became too great to bear? And yet, deep down, Eric knew that there was no turning back now. He had already made his choice. The cost of confronting his past would be high, but the price of running from it would be even higher. Eric's heart thudded heavily against his chest as he tried to steady his breathing, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. The cabin was small, confining, and the air felt thicker than it should have been. He could still feel the cool chill of the hallway in his bones, but it was the oppressive stillness of the room that weighed on him now. The man's eyes, unwavering and cold, seemed to strip away any illusions Eric had left. This was no longer a simple journey. It was a confrontation, one that Eric could not avoid, no matter how hard he tried. The man's words lingered in Eric's mind. "It's time to stop running." They were simple, but the gravity behind them made them impossible to ignore. For so long, Eric had believed that he was in control, that his ability to move on, to keep changing his circumstances, made him immune to the consequences of his past. He had adopted new identities, new personas, and in every place he went, he shed the skin of who he had been. But here, in this dimly lit cabin, he felt the truth of it. There was no escaping what he had done, no mask that could hide his guilt. The man watched him carefully, a faint glimmer of knowing in his eyes. "You think you can change yourself, don't you? That with every new place, Every new face, you can bury your past, he said, almost as if Eric's thoughts had been laid bare. But the truth is, Eric, the faces we wear are just that, faces. They're not the truth of who we are. And no matter how many you wear, the truth will always find its way out. Eric wanted to argue, to fight back, but the words felt hollow. How many times had he reinvented himself? How many times had he moved from city to city, leaving behind old relationships, old mistakes, and even old names? The person he had been, someone he could barely recognize now, had been lost in the fog of constant reinvention. And yet, in this cabin, under the gaze of this strange man, the weight of those identities felt like a burden he could no longer escape. "I've tried," Eric muttered, almost to himself, as the man's eyes bore into him. "I've tried to outrun it, to leave everything behind. I thought I could start over." The man leaned forward, his voice soft but sharp. "And did you? Did you truly start over? Or did you simply bury the past deeper, thinking it wouldn't catch up with you?" Eric's stomach churned. He wanted to scream that he had changed, that he had moved on, but the truth clawed at the edges of his thoughts. No matter how far he had run, no matter how many new identities he had crafted, the past had always followed him. It was like a shadow that grew longer the more he tried to escape it. He looked down at his hands, remembering the faces of those he had abandoned. The girl, the one he had loved, the one he had left behind. Her image was always there, lurking in the corners of his mind. Every new face he encountered seemed to remind him of her, as though he had never truly escaped. Her eyes had followed him, and no matter how many times he moved, they always found him. The man's voice broke through his thoughts, steady and insistent. "You've spent your life running, Eric, but you're forgetting something important. Running doesn't mean freedom. It means fear. Fear of confronting who you truly are. Fear of facing the person you've become. And as long as you keep running, that fear will consume you." Eric's pulse quickened. Fear. It was a word he had avoided for so long. He had never allowed himself to feel it, at least not consciously. But now, as the man's words sank deeper into him, Eric realized that he had been afraid all along. Afraid of confronting his own inadequacy, afraid of the damage he had caused, and most of all, afraid of the emptiness that came with leaving pieces of himself behind. "Who am I then?" Eric finally asked, the question hanging heavy between them. "If I'm not the faces I wear, then who am I?" The man gave him a slow, almost pitying smile. "That's the question, isn't it? Who are you, Eric? Are you the man who ran, or are you something more? The truth is, you can't keep hiding from yourself. You can change your name, your face, your life, but you can't outrun your own soul." For the first time since he had boarded the train, Eric felt the truth of those words resonate within him. His whole life had been a series of masks. Masks to cover up the hurt, the mistakes, the people he had wronged. But in this moment, in the silence of the cabin, he realized that the masks had become him. He didn't know who he was beneath them anymore. As he stood there, the reality of the man's words crashed down on him. He had spent so much time running from his mistakes, from the pain he had caused to others, that he had forgotten what it meant to be honest with himself. The person he had tried so hard to escape, the version of himself that had been stained by guilt and regret, was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be confronted. "Are you ready to face it?" the man asked, his voice quiet but piercing. "Are you ready to stop hiding from the person you've become?" Eric swallowed hard, his throat dry. The choice was before him now, and there was no more room for evasion. This was the moment when he could either continue his journey of self-deception or face the truth that had been waiting all along. It wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it might shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. But as the words lingered in the air, Eric knew there was only one choice left. He had to face the man in the mirror, the real man, not the faces he had worn for so long. "I'm ready," he whispered, the weight of his decision settling over him like a cold wave. As the train's wheels hummed steadily beneath him, Eric's mind swirled with a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The weight of his decision had settled deep within him, and yet he still found himself grappling with the consequences. It was one thing to recognize the masks he had worn. It was another entirely to strip them away. He had spent so long convincing himself that he was someone else, someone better, someone different, that the idea of returning to the core of his true self felt almost impossible. But the cabin, the man's words, and the unsettling stillness around him were relentless, urging him forward into a confrontation he had long evaded. The train rattled through the night, its dim lights flickering as if it, too, was uncertain of the path ahead. The familiar hum of the journey was no longer comforting. Eric's fingers drummed nervously on the table in front of him, the soft clicking of his nails echoing in the otherwise silent room. Each click was a reminder of his own hesitation, the lingering fear that had gripped him ever since he had made the decision to face the truth. It wasn't just the man's words that haunted him. It was the very nature of his past. The memories, once buried under layers of distractions, began to surface. They came in fragments, as though his mind was slowly piecing together a jigsaw puzzle he had long abandoned. Faces, moments, and decisions from his past life flooded back to him, like waves crashing against a fragile shore. It wasn't just the girl he had left behind. It was everything. The lies he had told, the people he had hurt, the relationships he had fractured. They were all part of the person he had been, and in some twisted way, they were all still part of him. Each recollection felt like a crack in his armor, each piece of his former self adding weight to the burden he now carried. He had tried to run, to escape, but the past was not something that could simply be outrun. It followed him with a tenacity that Eric had underestimated. No matter how far he went, no matter how many times he reinvented himself, the past had always found a way to catch up. The past was not just a series of mistakes. It was a collection of experiences that shaped who he was. And as much as Eric had tried to deny it, those experiences had never truly left him. They had molded him, for better or worse, into the man who now sat on the train, staring out the window into the endless stretch of darkness. He couldn't simply erase them. The man in the cabin had been right. The faces he wore were only temporary disguises, and beneath them, there was a person who needed to be acknowledged, no matter how difficult that might be. His eyes drifted to the window, where the dim light from the train's interior cast a faint reflection of his face. It was strange to see himself reflected back in such a way, an unfamiliar face staring back at him. He wasn't the man he had been before, but he wasn't sure who he was becoming either. Was he simply a collection of mistakes, of failed attempts at reinvention? Was this who he was always destined to be? Or could he find a way to redeem himself, to confront the person he had been and somehow rise above it? The more he pondered it, the more overwhelming the task seemed. Confronting the past wasn't just about acknowledging what he had done. It was about facing the person he had tried so hard to outrun. The man in the cabin had offered him no easy answers. There was no simple fix, no magic solution to erase his past. It would be painful, and it would require a level of honesty he had avoided for years. But as the train sped through the night, Eric realized that this was the only way forward. He could either continue down the path of self-deception, or he could face the truth, however uncomfortable it might be. But even as the resolve settled within him, there was a nagging doubt at the back of his mind. What if facing the truth wasn't enough? What if the past he had tried to escape was so deeply ingrained in him that there was no escaping its shadow? What if the very essence of who he had been was too damaged, too tainted, to ever move beyond? These thoughts swirled around him like a storm, and for a moment, Eric considered the possibility that perhaps some things were beyond redemption. As the train rattled on, the night outside seemed to stretch on forever. The rhythmic sound of the wheels against the tracks was like a lullaby for his troubled thoughts, offering a false sense of peace amidst the storm inside his mind. It was easy to get lost in the sound, to pretend that everything would somehow resolve itself. But Eric knew better. This was not a journey that could be ignored, and it was not a path that could be avoided. Whether he liked it or not, the truth was coming for him. He leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, trying to quiet the turmoil in his mind. There was no escaping the questions that plagued him, no running from the shadows of his past. But perhaps for the first time in his life, Eric could find peace, not in trying to outrun the past, but in accepting it. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it was the only one that could lead him towards something real. When the train's whistle sounded in the distance, breaking the silence of his contemplation, Eric opened his eyes. The light in the cabin flickered once more, and he glanced at the door, where he could faintly see the reflection of his own face once more. This time, however, it didn't seem so unfamiliar. For the first time in a long while, Eric was ready to face the person staring back at him. The journey was not over. It had only just begun. Eric awoke with a start, his body stiff from the long hours of sitting. The rhythmic hum of the train had lulled him into a restless sleep. But now, as the sunlight began to filter through the windows, it seemed to magnify the weight of the thoughts he had been avoiding. The soft flicker of the cabin's overhead lights seemed to hold an eerie quality, casting elongated shadows on the walls as though they were reaching out, trying to hold him captive. The world outside the window was still a blur of passing trees and fields, but it was as though the fleeting scenery could not escape the tension that now filled the air. His mind was no longer a silent battlefield. The flood of memories he had pushed away was no longer content to remain hidden. The faces of those he had hurt, the girl, his family, the friends he had lost, emerged from the recesses of his consciousness like ghosts with unfinished business. Each memory clung to him with a certain heaviness, as though they had grown stronger in his absence, waiting for the moment when he would be forced to face them. His hands clenched in a fist at his sides, as though the very act of touching something solid could anchor him to the present, rather than allowing the past to consume him whole. The man in the cabin had been clear. There was no escape from the past. The more Eric resisted, the stronger the pull of the past became. It was as if his very attempt to outrun it had only fueled its persistence. Each time he moved forward, a part of him would break away, unraveling, until there was nothing left of the person he had once been. There was a bitter irony in it all. In trying to run from his mistakes, he had only given them more power over him. His decision to board the train had seemed like an act of liberation, a chance to start fresh. But the more time passed, the more it became clear that the past had already found a way to board the train with him. The cabin was quieter now, but the silence seemed unnaturally heavy. He wasn't alone anymore. The other passengers had become mere shadows in the corners of his vision, their presence as inconsequential as the scenery outside the window. They seemed to glide past him, lost in their own thoughts, indifferent to the storm that raged within him. And yet, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that they were all part of something larger, something he couldn't quite comprehend. The man in the cabin had warned him that the journey wasn't just about confronting the past. It was about understanding the truth of who he was and why he had become what he had. But how could he face the truth if he couldn't even face himself? He had spent so many years trying to outrun the weight of his decisions. But what if there was nowhere to go? What if the train, this endless, unrelenting journey, wasn't just a metaphor for his life, but a symbol of the inescapability of his actions? The wheels clattered steadily beneath him, a constant reminder that no matter how far he traveled, he would always be moving in a circle. There would be no destination, no final escape. The train would continue to move forward, but it would never leave behind the darkness of his past. A sense of panic rose within him as he considered the possibility that this train was not simply a means of transportation. It was a prison, a cage built from his own mistakes. Each stop merely another reminder of how trapped he was in his own life. The more he tried to escape, the more the past tightened its grip on him. Each memory, each regret a chain that shackled him to a version of himself that he couldn't outrun. It was like a broken record, playing the same painful melody over and over again, with no way to stop the cycle. He had convinced himself that there was a way to outrun it, that if he just kept moving, just kept running, he could leave the past behind. But with each passing minute, it became clear that this was not the case. The past was not something to be outrun. It was something to be understood, to be faced. It was part of him, as much a part of his identity as the person he had tried to become. And no matter how much he resisted, it would remain like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. Eric's mind shifted uncomfortably, and he could feel the weight of the cabin pressing in around him. The passengers seemed oblivious to the turmoil he felt, their faces unreadable, their voices hushed and distant. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. The man in the cabin, the one who had spoken so cryptically about the past, was standing at the far end of the car, staring directly at him. His expression was inscrutable, as though he had been waiting for this moment. The man's presence sent a jolt of recognition through Eric, but it was not the kind of recognition he expected. It was not the feeling of clarity he had been searching for. No, it was the unsettling sense that the man had been here all along, always watching, always knowing, always waiting. Eric's breath caught in his throat as he realized that the man was not merely a part of the train. He was part of the journey itself. This was not just a train ride. It was a reckoning. The train's whistle blew sharply, signaling another stop, but Eric could hardly hear it over the rush of blood in his ears. He was no longer just a passenger. He was part of something larger, something that had been set into motion long before he boarded this train. The questions were no longer theoretical. The past had found him, and it was not letting go. The train would not stop until it had run its course. Eric closed his eyes, bracing himself for whatever awaited him at the end of this long, inevitable journey. The train had entered a foggy stretch of wilderness. The scenery outside the window was obscured by the thick mist that clung to the tracks, its presence so dense that the world beyond was little more than a vague, formless shadow. Eric found himself staring out at the opaque grayness, as though searching for something, anything, that might offer clarity. But the more he looked, the more the landscape seemed to pull away from him, leaving him with a growing sense of detachment, as though he were trapped in a dream, unable to wake. The figure of the man in the cabin lingered in Eric's mind. He had seemed like an enigma, someone who existed outside the boundaries of the train's reality. But now, as the train chugged along through the fog, the boundaries between the man and the journey itself had begun to blur. The past, which had remained distant and fragmented in his memory, now felt like an inescapable force. It was as though the fog outside the train wasn't just a weather phenomenon. It was a physical manifestation of his own confusion and guilt. Eric could feel the weight of the man's eyes on him, even though he had not seen him for hours. Every glance, every passing moment felt like it was building towards something monumental. The tension that had been slowly creeping up his spine was now an undeniable pressure, pressing in from all sides. It felt as though the walls of the train were closing in, leaving him with nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The train's whistle sounded again, sharp and commanding. This time, it didn't feel like a signal of another stop. It felt like a countdown. Eric's breath quickened, and his hands trembled as he placed them on the edge of the seat, gripping it for support. He could feel the train's motion beneath him, but it no longer felt like a smooth ride. The constant shifting of the carriages now felt more like a rolling descent, as though they were being pulled towards something inevitable, something he could no longer escape. The fog had thickened further, now enveloping the train entirely. It seemed to absorb the sound around them, deadening even the usual hum of the wheels. Eric's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that the train was no longer following a course. It was lost. The destination that had seemed so far away had become a mystery, an impossibility. Where were they headed? Was there even an end to this journey? And then, as if summoned by his thoughts, the man appeared again, standing at the end of the car, his figure somehow more distinct against the fog. This time, Eric did not look away. There was something about the man's presence that felt like an unspoken invitation, an invitation to confront the reality he had been avoiding for so long. Eric's mind raced, his thoughts clashing like waves against rocks. This was it, the moment he had been dreading, the moment that would decide everything. The man took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate and unervingly calm. "Do you see it now?" he asked, his voice low, but carrying an undeniable weight. Eric opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The man's gaze was intense, and for the first time, Eric felt the weight of the entire journey pressing down on him. It wasn't just the train that was pulling him forward, it was his own reckoning. The walls around him seemed to close in tighter, each inch a reminder that there was no turning back. Eric swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. I don't understand. I've tried to escape this, to move on, but his voice trailed off as the man slowly approached, stopping just inches from him. The man's face was now clear, his features sharp and unmistakable, and in his eyes, Eric saw something he couldn't quite place, something dark, something ancient, a reflection of his own struggles, his own guilt. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This man, this journey, was not some external force. He was a part of Eric, a reflection of everything he had buried. "You can't outrun yourself," the man said, his voice now a whisper. "You've been running for so long that you forgot the truth. The past isn't something to be escaped from. It's something you have to live with, face, and make peace with. You've tried to run from the mistakes, but they're part of who you are. They always have been." Eric staggered back, his hand gripping the seat for support. It felt like the ground was shifting beneath him, the walls closing in tighter with each word. He had known, deep down, that this was true, that running hadn't solved anything, that the only way out was through the pain he had been avoiding for so long. But now, in this moment, it felt like too much to bear. The weight of all his regrets, all his guilt, came crashing down on him. "You knew this day would come," the man continued, his voice unyielding. "You knew this journey wasn't about escaping. It was about confronting what you've done, understanding why you've done it, and accepting the consequences." He paused, letting the silence hang between them like a heavy fog. "But the question is, Eric, are you ready to face it?" The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Eric's mind swirled in a storm of confusion, but amidst the chaos, something clicked. A part of him, buried beneath the layers of guilt and fear, recognized the truth. This was it. This was the final moment. He couldn't keep running. The past wasn't going anywhere. It would always be a part of him, and the only way to truly escape the cycle was to confront it head-on. The fog outside seemed to press in closer as Eric finally took a breath, his chest rising with the weight of the decision he had to make. It wasn't just a decision about the train, it was a decision about himself. The journey had taken him far, but now it was time to reach the final station. And there, waiting for him, was the truth. Would he face it? Would he confront the person he had been? Or would he continue down the tracks, lost in the fog of his own denial? The train had come to a sudden halt, its screeching brakes pulling Eric out of his trance-like state. The fog outside had thickened even further, and yet, through the window, there was a faint light, perhaps from a distant station or a fading memory. It seemed like the world had narrowed down to this one small moment, this point where every decision would converge. It was a peculiar feeling, the sense that time had both stretched and contracted at once. The journey had felt endless, but now, as the train ground to a stop, Eric understood. The journey had always been within him. He had never truly been moving forward. He had only been running in place, circling his own fears. Inside the train, everything was still. The passengers, whose faces had been so elusive throughout the ride, were now absent, vanished into the ether, just as the man who had haunted him had disappeared. It was as if they had never existed at all, their presence merely a figment of Eric's troubled mind. But the truth was, they were a part of him. The man, the other passengers, the mist. It had all been a reflection of Eric's own inner turmoil. And now that the train had stopped, it was as though the universe was demanding something from him. He could no longer hide behind the illusion of movement, the belief that he could outrun what had happened. The only way forward was through the silence. The stillness in the car was oppressive. Eric could hear the sound of his own breath, shallow and uneven, as though he had been holding it for far too long. But there was no more time to wait. The fog outside had enveloped the train entirely, but for the first time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like an invitation, an opportunity to step out and face the truth. The station, wherever it was now only a symbol. It was no longer about where the train had been headed. It was about where he would go next. Eric stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him as he made his way to the door. The train felt abandoned now, empty of any real passengers, yet filled with the ghosts of all the choices he had made. The metal door opened with a creak, and Eric stepped into the cold, damp air. The fog seemed to part just slightly, revealing a dimly lit platform ahead of him. It wasn't a station in the traditional sense. It was an in-between space, an area suspended between the past and the future, a place where everything was both final and infinite. The platform was deserted, save for one figure standing at its edge. It was him, the man, but now he seemed less like a tormentor and more like a guide. The distance between them was not one of physical space, but of understanding. The man had been waiting for Eric to reach this point. The confrontation had always been inevitable, but only now did Eric realize that it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about accepting the truth. "You've reached the end of the line," the man said softly, his voice no longer echoing with judgment. Instead, it was calm, almost compassionate. "But the end is not always what it seems. There is no final destination here. There is only the beginning of something new." Eric stood still, processing the words. The weight in his chest, the suffocating fear that had been gnawing at him for so long, was beginning to lift. It was as if the fog, both outside and within, was starting to dissipate. The train, the journey, it was all a metaphor, a manifestation of his own inability to accept the past. But now he understood. The train wasn't the thing that had trapped him. It was his refusal to confront the past that had kept him in motion, never reaching a true end. The man stepped closer, his eyes meeting Eric's. "You are not the same person you were when this journey began. You've changed. The questions you've had, the confusion, the fear, it's all part of your growth. This stop, this place, it's a moment of transition." Eric looked around, the fog now retreating just enough to let him see the station clearly. It was not a place of darkness, as he had imagined. Instead, it was a place where everything could be seen with clarity. The surrounding trees, the faraway hills, all were now bathed in soft light, not of any artificial source, but of something more primal, something true. The truth, perhaps, was not in the destination, but in the understanding that there was no destination, only a continuous journey of self-discovery. A strange sense of calm washed over him. The questions that had once plagued him, about guilt, about the past, about his own mistakes, no longer seemed so urgent. He realized now that he did not need to know everything. The truth was not a fixed point to be reached. It was an evolving understanding, one that would change as he grew. The man smiled, as though understanding Eric's shift. "You've made it," he said, "not because you've reached a destination, but because you've finally let go of the need to escape." And with that, the man turned and walked away, his figure slowly fading into the fog as if he had never been there at all. Eric stood alone on the platform, the train now completely gone. He could still hear the faint sound of its wheels grinding against the tracks in the distance, but the noise no longer felt like a reminder of something he had missed. It felt like the echo of a journey that had been completed. The fog had cleared enough now for Eric to see the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break. He was no longer trapped in the cycle of regret and denial. The past was not something to be outrun. It was a part of him, integral, unavoidable, but it no longer defined him. As Eric walked forward into the light, he understood that the journey was far from over. But now, for the first time, he was ready to walk it with his eyes open, not looking for an escape, but embracing the unknown with a sense of peace he had never known before. The train, the fog, the man, they were all part of the same story, and now it was time for him to start writing the next chapter.